Thank you very much, Dr. Shalini. Am I audible? Am I visible, etc.?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. And also thanks to Informatics for putting this event together. Always a pleasure to talk about information retrieval, library technologies, information sciences, etc. As you were told, I'm a statistician by training, which means that my work is mostly with data, various kinds of data that come from different places. And I have identities in academia, in entrepreneurship, in corporate training, etc. So I think today what I will do is kind of not wear any of those hats, but talk just about certain things that I have seen, certain things have been pointed out towards, and spend a little bit of time taking a slightly personal view on what I think, and as Dr. Shalini said, is a very important issue that is facing us at this point in time. I'm also going to step back a little bit, take a slightly historical look for certain things, just to set a context for what is happening now. And I think it's always important to see things revisited again. It was a pleasure to hear in Dr. Shalini's introduction the idea of rumors. And it reminded me of a paper that Abhijit Banerjee had written many years ago. Today we know Dr. Banerjee as one of the pioneers of development economics and poverty studies, etc. Before that, he was a theoretical economist and a very, very good one. And he took some wonderful ideas in probability and other areas to figure out how various little things in society can fit into economics ideas. One of them was envy, another was rumors. And he had a seminal paper on the economics of rumors, where he talked about how rumors spread from one entity to another. Now, the interesting thing about that research, I think the paper appeared in the early 1990s, was that at that point in time, this was a theoretical paper. In other words, the data needed to substantiate what he was talking about was not available at that time. Even if he had wanted to, he would not have been able to do an empirical study. It would be interesting to see Professor Banerjee's reaction now, maybe 30 years later, where what he talked about then as a mathematical model of Markov chains, etc., would be empirically validated for circumstances at this point in time. Anyway, that being said, I talked too much. I want to talk today about two things broadly. As I said, they're unrelated topics, just personal thoughts. One of them is on how do you organize social media in some way? How do you think of it as a platform? How do various professional communities realize that social media is a structure on its own, and therefore put some logic behind it and what it means for being able to do research and being able to get data? And the second half of the talk, I want to talk a little bit about research itself. I know that many of you are from academic institutions and your day job requires you perhaps to publish papers and write things. And has that changed? Has that evolved with social media? Is doing research in the social media era any different from doing research at any other time? And what role does technology play into it? And then some random thoughts on social media research, reproducibility, some ideas that are there. We're not going to be able to interact now, but there's a long session afterwards. I'll stay for the session and listen into whatever is there. And I hope that this stimulates some discussion, but otherwise just to plant certain seeds of thought in your head. Okay, now what are we talking about? Social media itself. This chart on what happens in an internet minute has been around from various organizations for a long time now, many years. It is a terrible chart to show for anyone giving a talk because it gets outdated on a daily basis. Which means that when I was giving this talk or a version of this talk maybe 3 years, 4 years ago, you need a different chart to talk about social media. So this one I was very sure was saying that, is it new? Are the numbers real? Are they not? I don't know. All I do know is that the article that this was taken from was last year, relatively recent, maybe a few months old. So maybe the numbers are reliable, but you can read them. And the point is not to impress you with big data. I mean, you've had a session on big data, but the point of this is to make the case that the various kinds of things that we call social media involve various kinds of information. It could be, for example, YouTube videos. It could be, for example, texts on, say, Twitter. It could be queries on Google. It could be emails with a lot of metadata. There are various kinds of data that's available on social media. It could be pictures. So these cell phones. My wife used to say that this has turned out to be my friend, philosopher, and guide. She wasn't entirely being truthful. It's also friend, philosopher, guide, and photographer. So we take our pictures all on devices such as these. So therefore, in devices such as these cell phones, you have pictures, you have audio files, you have texts, you have true multimedia. This means that when the kind of data that social media is generating from a statistician's perspective or from any other perspective is hugely, hugely varied. And it doesn't necessarily come in a balanced form. For those of you who work in information retrieval and shall we say, the IT side of things, an image, for example, the image that you're seeing on the screen here of my face or a video is a lot more in terms of bits and bytes than, for example, the word that you see my name underneath your screen. But that doesn't mean that the face is more important than the name. So there's an imbalance between the amount of data in bits and bytes and the amount of information that it contains in terms of knowledge. And this is something that people in information technology worry about all the time. And I remember many years ago when the Bluetooth standard was coming up in IBM, we were developing algorithms for saying how to transmit data along Bluetooth. And there was then the standards question of saying that how many packets of text and how many packets of images or multimedia can be sent or should be multicast along a wireless channel. And this depended on how much data people were sending and also how much data people wanted to consume. This had to be embedded into the standard, and right now Bluetooth and any of these standards have it all built in. But it relies on a very important idea, and the idea is that technology should be consistent with our sense of what information is. And this is not quite happening now. This is beginning to break down because what's happening is that data is coming in at a rate that is convenient to the infrastructure available. So if we have 3G, if we have 4G, if we have 5G, that lets a certain amount of bandwidth available. And so if more images can be transmitted, more images are transmitted. Simply because we can do it. As a practical matter, for example, if I take pictures on this cell phone camera, so I'm taking a picture, let's say, of my 8-year-old playing, and she moves around, she plays very quickly. It gets blurred. And then I take another picture and another until it's correct, which means I can take 3-4 pictures of the same thing, and it stays on my computer. If I was doing this when I was a child, let's say about 45 years ago, there would be 20 films or 24 films available in my camera, and I would need to be very careful not to waste them. Data was expensive, and data is now cheap because of the channels. And this is having implications on platforms and things of that sort. So how is all this organized? How is it put together? Here's an example. This is a conceptual framework, and it comes from a paper from the University of Maryland and many others. You may not think of this as canon, but it's interesting to me. It was interesting to me when Dr. Shalini sent it to me, was that this is about how healthcare data can be organized in a way that makes logical sense. Now, this is something that has evolved over a period of time. So, for example, research 20 years ago, when it was being done, let's say in multimedia healthcare, let's say, for example, in omics, you had text data from PubMed, you had GenMax data or corresponding data on gene sequences, You had protein sequences data from KEGG, from Kyoto in Japan. And so therefore text data and sequence data and protein structure data were very difficult to assimilate. This was a major technological challenge and many companies were working on that. That challenge has gone away. Now, all of this can be put into frameworks of, for example, retrieval of the data. In other words, recovering an image, recovering a paper. Today, if I want to download a PubMed paper, I know how to do that. My computer with its GPU unit, with its retrieval unit can do that. If I want to download an image, let's say a protein structure image or any complicated image, this computer has an NVIDIA chip, for example, that can do the processing of that image in almost the same amount of time that it takes to process the text. So all that becomes very easy to do. So now these platforms are sort of data integrated, time integrated in order to be able to provide information in one flow at one rate. This rate information is important because let's say that you're trying to improve care. Now, if you're improving care and you want to transmit the doctor's voice over a medium, and if that comes a lot quicker than, let's say, a scan report or an image, then there's a difficulty in harmonizing this telemedicine solution. And these were still difficulties till about 5-6 years ago, which has now sort of gone away because of the ability to put all of these things together. Now, from a patient perspective, what that essentially means is that most of this kind of social media information has become neutral. What does that mean to a neutral? Which means that when a patient comes in and says, "What is it, doctor, that you can tell me about myself?" And whether that doctor gets that information from a database or whether that doctor gets that information from a set of tweets or a Twitter, it doesn't quite matter. Platforms are able to take care of these things. Now, from a research perspective, this has meant very interesting things. And the authors of this paper talk of 4 Ps: participant, platform, problem, and process. In saying that, what is it that the social media gives us new information that is available now to patients and to healthcare providers that can do perhaps what an earlier generation of technology could not do? One, of course, from a participant's perspective is health literacy, in being able to get information. Now, is this a good thing? There could be a reasonable argument that it's not necessarily a good thing regarding the example that you just heard about what exactly does a vaccine do and is it safe for you and things of that sort. So therefore, now these are complicated issues requiring a substantial amount of shall we say, trust in the system to be able to do this. Because a vaccine, in practical terms, is making you ill, but it's not making you ill enough. It's making you a little bit ill so that your body knows how to deal with the illness in a way that doesn't hurt you. It's like learning mathematics in school. You learn it in a protected environment, and then when the joint entrance exam comes, you're out in the wild and you have to succeed. So your body is learning how to deal with this infection. But that's a subtle idea. That's not an easy idea to grasp, because the first part of that idea could easily be, oh, but you are infecting me. How do I know this is safe? Well, to some extent, definitionally, it is not safe, because if it was completely safe, the vaccine wouldn't work. It's meant to be a little unsafe, but just unsafe enough so that your body knows how to protect it, how to defend against something. It's being trained. It's like going to school. But this causes major dangers because this entire logical strain of information needs to be processed. And this cannot be done, let's say, in 140 characters or 280 characters, or in a 10-minute video, or in a talk like mine. You have no reason to believe me. I'm sitting here with, white hair on my head and speaking very seriously, but I'm not a doctor. And why on earth would you believe anything I say? Which is a logical, reasonable stand to take, the issue of credibility. So therefore, all the information that's coming, and there's a lot of it, how do you put that into a platform that says that this is what literacy is, and this is what information is, and this is what misinformation is? And so how do I put that together and make it available to participants? And that is what frameworks such as these are supposed to be doing. And many hospitals, healthcare providers, and many other industries are also trying to do this. This is not unique to healthcare, this particular approach. Uh, Let me pick another one, for example, on, let's say, chronic diseases, on a specific problem, and how to deal with continuous illness. Now, here the approach is of being able to say that, is there a community around me? Is there a community that is suffering the same way that I am suffering? So let's say that by definition, there's information for me. But also because of the nature of my disease, if I'm a heart patient, by definition, I'm not going to be able to go around a lot. I may be able to go downstairs and take a walk. That may be what my doctor recommended. If I suffer from dementia, then that may be something that the doctor is not recommending. So if I cannot relate to society physically because of my disease, then this gives me a medium to relate to society. And that's a very powerful connect. Allowing me to say, it's okay, others who are suffering from dementia, others who are suffering from heart disease, etc., how are they dealing with this? How are they dealing with cancer? How is the standard of care in different countries, in different communities? Can I do something differently? Should I eat something different? Is there something that I didn't know about? A particular kind of vegetable, for example, that gives greater immunity to me. And together with health literacy, I can then validate that and say that that's a good thing, which is what platforms are supposed to be doing. Now, in terms of research itself, to close the loop on what we're talking about, can we do research on these things? Can we do assessments? Can we do interventions? Can we know whether something worked or not? Now, this is not very easy to immediately validate. Many of you remember, for example, about Google Flu. So Google Flu was a wonderful thing that we would talk about a lot, which was a solution that essentially tracked social media posts or queries, to be more precise, queries on Google. And it made the point that if I can track what people are searching on the internet, I will be able to track an epidemic. Wisdom of the crowd. In other words, the idea being that communities know that there is something going around. People are falling ill. There are sniffles. There are all kinds of things that are going on in the community. I can see people falling ill. Let me ask. And so there's increased activity. And this activity, internet activity on a disease, is a predictor of an epidemic or predictor of increase. And this worked for a while. This worked very well for a while before people realized it isn't that easy. Right? There are issues of insufficient data. There are issues of confounding. And you can look at the research and see what didn't quite go well with Google Flu. But it took time to figure out. This is dangerous because if it takes, say, 2 years to understand that the social media research was not as complete as you thought, but the impact of it is in the space of days, then that's a very problematic thing to implement. Because you want to say, people are talking about this, but maybe 2 years later, it'll be discovered that they're wrong. How will you operate? How will you trust? How will you do this? So people are now getting a little scared about this. And they're saying, okay, let's hang on. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the second half of the talk. And we're getting there. Now, the other side of this is, to some extent, impact assessment or using this kind of information for research itself. Let me give an example. You've seen, I think, in other parts of this conclave, ideas in AI, ideas in deep learning. And the idea of deep learning is, or one of the ideas in deep learning is that you can get a lot of information from unstructured data. For example, text. Now, text, how I type, how I write things, reflects how I think, who I am. How is my brain wired? Now, sometimes you can think differently. You can think like Yoda in Star Wars. There is no try. Tired I am. That may be your style. But there are also reflections in language, in how you post things, that tell you a little bit about how your head is wired. Wonderful. Now, can I do this? Can I then look at text and can I understand whether there is something wrong in the way your brain is wired? In general, no. You could say, what? This is the way I speak. We are like this only. How will you tell I am good or bad based on what I write? What is this? So how I speak has nothing to do with what I am, but in extreme cases, perhaps. So let's say someone has dementia, Alzheimer's, or something in which thoughts are not passing very well between the hemispheres. That will reflect itself in how you write. So on the X side of your model, you can have text. On the Y side of your model, you can have dementia. And you can have complicated things like convolution, neural networks, etc., that basically say that can I use text in order to be able to detect dementia? In other words, based on how you are posting things, and I can go to a dementia chat room, I can go to a social media forum, and I can say, let me look at those posts, and let me try and diagnose how far along in the disease they are. Now, does this work? Once again, maybe it will take us 2 years to figure out, and many more trials. But these are promising in two ways. One is as deep learning technology itself. And the second is as a way to continuously monitor someone. This is very important, particularly for someone who has dementia or is homebound. And particularly in many countries where they don't have too much caregiving. And you can track a person, and you can track them by home devices. You can track them by saying, let me put a camera, a CCTV, and do the imaging part of this. And so this is just one more instrument that's available to you. So social media platforms in healthcare and beyond are putting data together in a way that allows for the sharing of information, as a way of retrieving the information, as a way of analyzing that information, to get knowledge, and as a way of getting new insights based on that data. Very nice. But what does all of this have to do with our ways of doing research? Research itself, I'm moving to the second part of the talk now, research itself is something that has been around for a long, long time. Professor Shalini talked about our time in MIRA, and I remember both Professor Shalini and I and all our colleagues working very hard to make sure that students did projects well. And they followed a process, not a free-form stream of consciousness on a piece of paper. That they did things in a logical way. And research is very often about doing things in a logical way. You search, and then you research. And you search again, and then you research again. And so this process of looking at things in a structured way is what makes something research versus maybe just looking at books, which is what I do all the time. I would often complain, I can't do research. I mean, I don't know how this is done. My PhD from one of the leaders in the field, Professor Bradley Efron, and he celebrated his 80th birthday a couple of years ago, and all his students were requested to come to Stanford. And at the end, he gave a talk, and he looked at all of us, and he said that I was not a good advisor to you, which is not true. He was a very good advisor. I was not a good advisor to you. I did not tell you exactly how to do the various steps involved, but you figured it out differently, and all of you had very different careers in how you have chosen to do this. So his argument would be that there is no unique way to do research. But if there is no unique way to do research, there'll be a little bit of chaos. Chaos in journals. Is this a good paper? Is this not? Chaos in PhD advisors and all of that. So the question is, has social media added to this chaos? Has it reduced this chaos? What does social media have to say about research itself? So one side of the question, social media leads to research. The other is, can research be done using social media in its current structure? So when you do research, of course, and this is from a science fair, is for kids, so it's simple enough to understand, you do certain things. So for example, you construct a hypothesis. I talk about hypothesis so much. My 8-year-old is going around the house saying null hypothesis all the time. We're having to shut her up. But seriously, you do hypothesis and you say, is this true? or is this false? And if it is false, prove to me that it is false. You test with an experiment. You do something. You go out and you get data. Maybe you run a survey, maybe you don't. Maybe you look at the literature, maybe you do an experiment in the lab, depending on your field. And you figure out whether something is working or not, or whether something is true or not. And if it is, you draw conclusions. If it isn't, you go back and you check things a little bit. You say that this is not working, but is it not working because it's wrong? Or is it not working because something is different in my procedure? There are many discoveries which turned out to be not quite right. And opposite is also true. Initially, the cosmic background radiation, sort of the shadow of the Big Bang that we see all around us, we see it in our old televisions as well. That signal came, and it was thought to be actually, bird droppings, bird shit basically on the telescope. And they said, this can't be. I mean, they didn't believe it. They said, no, this must be birds doing things on my telescope. This kind of careful checking is something that researchers do. And it's a part of their job. That's why PhDs, for example, take time. That is why projects are requested to document their prior work. They document their research design and keep going. Now, the question is, can you do this? Does social media permit you a platform or a procedure for being able to do this? So here's an example, and this is from a study done, I think, in the University of Southampton in UK and other places. And it's an interesting data set. And this data, as you can see from the early part of the previous decade, is tracking two things. This is from the Netherlands, Dutch data, and is tracking confidence index, consumer confidence index. And it is tracking a social media index. You can see two lines here. One which is circles, which is what I would call traditional data. This is consumer confidence. And consumer confidence is something that economists have been tracking all the time. Yesterday, there was economic survey being released, and our economic offices track consumer confidence in various kinds of things. And they track it according to a certain way, by tracking a sample of people, sample of goods. There's a very logically designed and academically approved way to do this. Good stuff. And let's say you do that. And the way you do that, quite simply, is saying that how many people have a positive confidence and how many people have a negative confidence. And you can subtract one from the other, divide by the total number, and get some kind of index. So, for example, if the number is negative, let's say on this side, it means that by and large, people do not have a positive confidence in whatever it is that you are tracking. Now, you will see later on in today's session, other sessions as well, you can also do something like this online, and it's called sentiment analysis. So what you can do is you can track discussions online, and you can say, are people happy or are people not? Is this positive sentiment, negative sentiment? And you can similarly track social media, and you can do positive sentiment minus negative sentiment, and you can get the same thing. Not from a long-term experiment that takes 2 years to do, or in India, for example, every 2 years we release curated versions of this data, but immediately using social media analysis tools. Very, very powerful. But do they track? Are they tracking the same thing? Are they saying the same thing? Are the dots and the crosses giving the same information? Right? Now, you can do time series analysis and whatever, say that, yes, this looks to be that. Maybe one is a slight leading indicator or lagging indicator of the other, etc. And this gives a certain amount of faith in using social media data to replace a classical statistical way of doing things. So therefore, this is powerful. This is wonderful stuff, because you can say that, hey, now I don't want to do all that. All this stuff that I learned in research methodology and in econometrics classes and all of that, all complete nonsense. All I need to do is I need to do a social media analyzer in Python and R, track my social media, do a sentiment analysis, and boom, I know what people feel. Is this correct? Number one. Number two, is this good research? Number two. And this is something that people are struggling with a lot. And what people have obviously discovered is that there is a carefulness that needs to go on in this process, in being able to understand that if I am following, shall we say, the left-hand side of this picture, which is, shall we say, the traditional way of doing it, identify a target, identify a measure that I will do, let's say a consumer confidence index or anything else that you are measuring. These are not easy things to measure, as you all know. For example, what is inflation? Inflation of what? Prices of what? Prices of cars, prices of potatoes, prices of what particular combination of things? And where? If you are saying the prices of potatoes where? In a supermarket in Bengaluru or Mysuru? In the villages? Where is it? So this isn't clear, and it needs very careful definitions that experts agree on. So the left-hand side is that, shall we say, conventional way of doing things. Now, to mirror that, so to speak, from, say, text data or social media data requires a substantial amount of care. And this is what many authors are beginning to talk about in papers such as this. This is from the International Statistical Review, and it's the last year's paper, and people are realizing that we can't simply analyze the data the same way. Let me give an example. Let's say that you are talking about clusters. Now, I love this word clustering. So if you're talking to, let's say, someone in geography, a cluster means something very different from, let's say, you're talking to someone in machine learning. So in geography, for example, a cluster could be a cluster of people, a cluster of villages, a region. So let's say that you've identified a geographic cluster, let's say a district. So once you've identified this district, you then go and ask people in that district. You can do this in stratified sampling, cluster sampling, many kinds of ways. Many districts and a little bit in each district, or a few districts and very completely in each district. This is a cluster. And now this cluster is now part of your design. Now, where is that cluster in Twitter? Now, Twitter obviously has a cluster, but Twitter's cluster is very different. Twitter's cluster comes from its metadata of computers and where you log in, and it may not have the necessary geographic orientation that your research design cluster had. So then how do I harmonize this? Which way do I go? And how do I link the sets? In other words, do I then define my geographic clusters in a way that Twitter sort of understands and is linked to Twitter's date stamp, time stamp, location stamp? You could be connecting it from a server, and the server may be in a different location from your client, all the IT stuff that I don't know very well. So this harmonization is needed in order that the same kind of research design can be lifted over. That's just one example. So, and this leads to new kinds of errors, errors in mapping, errors in identification. When I read these papers, it reminded me of what my generation of economists would talk about instrumental variables and finding an instrument to do things. Maybe that kind of work is what is needed. But my point being that there's a little more thought that needs to go into this. And that thought is already beginning to get underway. This is very, very compelling research in terms of, shall we say, usefulness. One of the things PhD students, one of the things scholars worry about is where do they get their data from? And good PhDs 10 years ago, 20 years ago were PhDs that got good data. And if you had a very good data set to work on, you'd probably get your paper published and probably get a good PhD. Today, data is not the problem. Data is there. It's just a question of, therefore, saying, not do you have good data? Yes, you can write a web crawler and get very good data. Current data, nice data, and you can put a query around it. The question is that when you do work with that data, are your conclusions valid? And so there's a lot of methodology that now needs to be reworked to solve this problem. And I think some leading researchers are talking about this. So the other side, as I said, social media gives information, but how to convert that information into research is something that I think this generation will figure out. So for those of you who in the audience who are maybe writing your PhDs now, when you are senior faculty members, if you are in academia, you will probably have a slightly different paradigm of research, of how it is done. Other things in big data analysis also relate to this. How do we deal with this large amount of genomic data, astronomy data that comes in, but it tells a coherent story. Now, I want to end with a slightly personal take on this, relating to the point that I just mentioned, which is to talk about the idea of reproducibility. So, reproducibility is something that doesn't come to mind immediately when we have research. One output of research is a publication, and once the publication is there, we tend to ignore it, in the sense that we tend to say, done, move on, next. But the research is there, it's sitting there, it's archival, it's state of knowledge. This will be used again. In library sciences, we talk about H indexes and citations, which is entirely about the reuse of research. That whole field of scientiometrics and the whole field of intellectual endeavor is about saying how well can we reuse research and which research is being reused more. Now, this means that good research should be reproducible. Now, if it is not reproducible, then we have a huge danger in non-reproducible research being hugely cited. We're all in deep trouble. And there are famous studies, for example, the psychology studies in Stanford and famous places that are now slowly being discredited, not because they were wrong at the time, but because people have said that over the years we have found that that is not how humans behave with respect to authoritarian regimes. It was a very important study that said that when people are ordered to torture, they will torture. And now people are saying, maybe that's not right. But it took 40 years more for that to come out. Research, it isn't very reproducible. Now, if something is not reproducible, then it's not reproducible now. But if it is not reproducible over 2 years, social media has shrunk that reproducibility timeline. And it has made things difficult in a variety of ways. Now, there's a lot of research on this that you're welcome to look at in the National Academy of Sciences and others. But I'll give 3 examples or 3 pointers to this just as I end. From my own experience in doing this over a number of times in a number of scenarios, is the first problem that happens is that code becomes non-reusable. Now, in reproducible research, the idea typically is that if you've done the research and you run the program again on the data set, you'll get the same answers. So if I give my program and I made it available with my paper or maybe as an appendix on a website, and you take my code and you run it, you should be able to get results like mine. This no longer works very well, particularly when code becomes very quickly updated. So the program that I write now will not run, say next year, not because the code is wrong, but because there's been an upgrade in the software. Python has done something, R has done something, and this no longer works. Maybe the site has changed. The GSP technology or the JSON technology that was used to get the data has changed. And so code reuse is a difficulty. The second is that data that is available to me may not be available to you. If I go to Twitter and use Twitter's terms and conditions to get a chunk of social media, and you try to replicate that tomorrow, you will get a different chunk of data, maybe from the same population. But neither you nor I will have access to the full data. Particularly if you are in a university that's not willing to pay in maybe the hundreds of thousands of dollars required for unrestricted licenses. Which means that the terms and conditions enforced by sites makes continuous data collection or consistent data collection hard. Web crawlers may be blocked. Many of us have written applications and written a web crawler, and someone who's seen that this web crawler is getting data from my site and saying, no. You're not going to get research credit or money from my data. Let me block the crawler. So that's a term and condition that you cannot do that kind of crawling. And the third point, of course, is that these trends change rapidly. In other words, the social media information that you do, that the research that you do now will not be valid a month from now, not because it's wrong, but because social media itself has changed and the opinion has changed. And so therefore the research itself is becoming time-stamped. Now in certain fields like biology, that's okay. I mean, diseases evolve. Right? Biology papers come out, biology journals come out maybe once a week, maybe even more. Math papers come out maybe once a quarter. I mean, math journal publications. There's a reason why biomedical literature comes out so rapidly. Things change. Social media is changing even more rapidly. And so therefore, if you're going to do research, for example, in saying, I don't know, just to make something up, that if you are a farmer in a certain region, do you identify with the region or do you identify with your profession as a farmer? And you do the research today, you will get an answer. But that answer may be very different from what you got 3 months ago, and that answer may be very different from what you get 3 months from now, given circumstances. So this idea of writing a paper based on social media is something that's going to take a little bit of thinking. And so, for example, I know my informatics colleagues are there. What would the papers based on social media look like? And this is in many ways a huge opportunity for libraries. Because if this is what is happening, it means that corrections on papers, upgrades on papers, code updates on papers, new data posts, this becomes much more rapid on a paper. A paper is not done when it's written. And that will need to some amount of thinking or rethinking in what digital libraries will probably do when they track research in social media. So with that note, I want to sort of end. And I'm sure that the panelists in the discussions will have many more interesting things to talk about today. And I'll be there to listen and sort of figure out what it is that we do. So I'm going to stop here. And with these two thoughts in your mind, frameworks and how to do research in a social media world, let's see what else is out there. What other ways can we slice and dice this problem? Thank you very much for the opportunity, and back to you.